I'm Elle Embers, and this is Cosmic Curiosities.
Hey guys, and welcome to the first ever episode of Cosmic Curiosities. I'm your host, Elle Embers, and I am so excited that you're here, and we can share this journey together. But before we embark on our first adventure, I wanted to share this quote with you. This quote is by Sean Coyne. He said, "Whether you know it or not, your desire to tell your story comes from the urge to not just be creative, but from the need to help others. A well-told story is a gift because it teaches us how to confront our own discomforts." Now, why did I want to share this quote with you, you ask? Well, I feel as though it really sets the tone for today's episode. You see, I never felt the need to share my story. I always thought it was unimportant, or that people would judge me for it, think I'm strange or unusual. It wasn't until recently I learnt just how important sharing our stories could actually be. And as I'm sure you're aware, not one person's story is the same, even if they've shared the same path. We all hold a unique perspective, a different experience, and all of our stories are equally important because there's just so much that we can learn from each other. And with that being said, throughout this podcast, I'll ask you to keep an open mind because we're going to be diving into some topics that may not be considered quote-unquote normal in today's society. However, I've always found that there's something in the abnormal that ignites our curiosity. Perhaps that's what brought you here. But however you found yourself here, I'm glad. And I thought before we begin down this path together, maybe we should get to know each other. So I thought I'd share a little bit about my story with you. Tell you a little bit about how I found myself here. So, first, I suppose I should introduce myself. Hi, I'm Elle, and I grew up in Brisbane, Australia. I'm a wife, a mother, a daughter, and a friend. And from an outside perspective, I guess you could say my life could seem pretty normal. In the past, I've worked a normal job, I've done the school carpool, I've been your average neighbour who seems to live an average normal life. But if that's the case, how is it that I found myself here? How did I become a past life regressionist, a tarot reader, a soul map decoder, and now the host of a spiritual self-help podcast? Yeah, that doesn't sound very normal, right? Well, I guess I should probably give you a bit of a backstory. So, this all started when I was a kid. I figured out pretty early on that I didn't really fit in with the crowd. And if you were to ask me now, personally, I think being weird is all part of my charm. But I have always seen the world through a different lens. So much so that I was demonstrating psychic and mediumship abilities from a pretty early age. My first memory of this, I must have been around 4 years old. And although I was so young, it didn't take me long to realize that not everyone could see what I could see. And being different, well, most people weren't okay with that. I didn't know if something was wrong with me, or if I was just crazy. And yeah, well, some people, they'd probably say so. But As I got older, things didn't get any less weird. I went from just seeing spirits to predicting things and feeling things and knowing things that I really had no business knowing. And although the spirits that I was seeing weren't like the horrific scenes you'd picture from a horror film, even just mentioning them was still enough to freak people out. So I quickly learnt to hide this part of myself. After all, these spirits weren't hurting anybody. They weren't interfering with anything, and a lot of the time, they were just curious. Curious in what we were doing, where we were going, usual everyday activities. So maybe not mentioning them wasn't a bad thing. As I got older, I started finding the courage to tell my parents what I was seeing. And it quickly became clear to me that other people couldn't see these spirits. Therefore, they didn't see them the way that I did. So from their perspective, it must have been this really horrifying experience for me to witness this. And they couldn't understand why I wasn't more traumatized by the whole ordeal. So I learned the best way to deal with this was to just ignore it. Avoid catching any spirit's attention, and try to suppress the ability, hide it from others. It just wasn't worth the drama. And I didn't want to attract any unwanted attention to my family. As a family, we weren't traditionally religious. Our household was a very Buddhist mentality. So, spirits and reincarnation weren't out of the ordinary, but it also wasn't something we would openly discuss to random strangers. I tried really hard to fit in. I made sure I was friendly and tried to be confident, and was active in a lot of sport to keep myself busy. I even became a musician so I could learn how to perform. I thought it would make hiding in plain sight seem a lot easier. But when I was 10, my mother got diagnosed with a terminal illness, and we spent the next 2 years living in uncertainty. When I was 12, she passed away. This was the moment that I knew my life would never be the same. And amongst all this grief and trauma that the rest of my family was trying to process, my emotions were all over the place. And suddenly, keeping an ability of seeing dead people, that became a lot harder than I initially thought. So for every spirit I was seeing, 10 more would follow. But it was never her. It was never the spirit that I really wanted to see, more than any other. She just wasn't there. My abilities were amplifying more and more with these heightened emotions. And being a young girl heading into adolescence, they could not have picked a worse time. And as time went on, and I realized I wasn't going to see my mother's spirit the way I thought I still might, I started looking for ways to numb my senses. I didn't want to deal with it. So I started with, the usual teenage antics of partying, getting into trouble, and basically took it downhill from there. But eventually, numbing wasn't helping either. And my ability was getting way out of hand. I didn't know how to control it, and things were going from bad to worse. While trying to numb my senses, I was just putting myself in dangerous situations and dangerous environments. And by doing so, I was just becoming a beacon for negative energy and spirits to grab onto. I was making choices that I am not proud of. And it wasn't long before the spirits I was seeing went from curious and harmless to something much darker. And as my abilities increased, so did theirs. They began evolving and quickly went from just observing to touching to moving and finally attacking. Suddenly, things had progressed from a slight inconvenience to an actual physical danger. Not only were these spirits being able to move things around my house, they were able to throw things around my house. Light bulbs would just spontaneously explode. Friends would fear coming over in case of being attacked. And it got to a point where, you know the movie The Exorcist? Yeah. Almost started looking like a documentary. I was being physically attacked and would wake up with cuts and bruises and scratches, having no idea how I got them. Something needed to change. So when I realized that numbing wasn't the answer, I went searching for anyone or anything that might be able to help. I ended up turning towards the church. And while not having much experience with traditional religion, from what I had seen in movies, priests would help people in these situations, right? God would save them and they'd all live happily ever after. So I came to this conclusion that if God could save them, maybe he could save me. Maybe whatever I had done to deserve this, whatever sins I had committed, I'd be forgiven for, and I'd no longer be punished with this ability. But unfortunately, the church couldn't help me either. These spirits were able to physically hurt me and those around me, and as these attacks progressed, it was only a matter of time before something really horrible could happen. I was lost and beaten down. I had finally reached my breaking point. I found myself in the corner of a church bathroom, crying and praying for these spirits to leave me alone. Now, let's just open up a little sidebar here. With hindsight and knowing what I know now, would I have handled things differently? Well, yeah, absolutely. But that's what hindsight is, after all. And while I'm not a religious person now, perhaps things played out exactly as they were meant to. Maybe this was all part of a greater plan. Maybe that was the experience that I needed to find my inner power. Because the way that I see it now is we all have power within us. We all have the capabilities of creating or relieving our own suffering. And in that moment, in that bathroom, yeah, I was done suffering. So I pulled myself up. I looked them in the face, and I commanded that these spirits leave me alone. Now, I'm not condoning a fight with dark entities in church bathrooms by any means. But for me, this was a pivotal moment. And finally, they did retreat. And my abilities, they did subside. For a while, at least. And by the time I reached my mid to late 20s, my life would seem pretty normal. I got married, became a mother, and my life had completely changed since my adolescence. To be fair, my abilities would still sneak out occasionally, but overall, things were much more manageable. It wasn't until I was confronted with another death, one of a much younger nature, that I became more aware of my own mortality. And as I watched how my friends were picking up the pieces of this tragedy, I had to question myself. What would I regret if I wasn't here tomorrow? And with that, I knew I had a new struggle to face. You see, I'd been hiding a huge part of myself for so many years that I really didn't know who I was anymore. I'd made so many mistakes while trying to find ways to numb my senses, suppress my ability, that the level of guilt, trauma, and shame I was carrying around with me was just too confronting to look at. And after years of burying the pain, I decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my life that way. I wanted to change. I wanted to change the narrative of my story, change my mindset, change my reality, and just stop seeing myself with such a victim mentality. So, what would you do in that situation? For me, I decided I better find a way to start dealing with this shit. So I opened up the file cabinet in my mind. You know, the one where you place the memories and thoughts and feelings that are just like too painful and distressing. Yeah, that one. I started digging through it. And to say I was scared, that was an understatement. I was scared as hell. How did I know that revisiting these traumas wouldn't just hurt more than repressing them? Well, I guess I didn't. But the possibility of a positive end result, it just meant so much more to me than the fear. So I took the leap, ready to make change. And it started the process of inner work. I started looking for therapists who dealt in things like trauma release. But what I found instead was so much more than I bargained for. And during this process, I opened myself to things I never would have imagined. I partook in so many different therapies and healings and took steps towards learning what it really meant to forgive. Not just others, but myself. And knowing that in the past, I had done the best I could with the resources I had at the time. I had to learn to not dwell on the past, but to learn from it. I had to learn to find the courage to be my true and authentic self. I had to learn to trust myself and not fear my abilities, but learn to harness them. Maybe they were something good. Maybe they were meant to help. And initially, I never mentioned to anyone I was doing this. But after a couple of years, those around me started to notice. They noticed big shifts in my energy, changes in my behavior, and even in my appearance. And I started to let people in. I know, right? The girl that had constantly pushed people away as an act of protection, you know, thinking she was keeping them safe, keeping herself hidden, was now suddenly drawing people in by sharing her experiences. I know, right? Crazy. But before I knew it, people were asking me for advice, for readings, and telling me that I inspired them to start their own journey and really find themselves. So I guess you could say it became clear to me what my mission was. To be your Earthside spirit guide. Hey, you know what? I kind of like that. So anyway, I set out to explore the best possible ways I could do this. And I began training and working with different spiritual practitioners that I admired. Practitioners who had inspired me with their knowledge, abilities, and their overall love and care for the world and the people in it. And I've never told anyone this, but as my abilities started to return, and I started trying to embrace them instead of hide them, my spirit guides made quite the entrance, with my mother along with them. And delaying my soul's purpose, it just was no longer an option. So I launched my business and became a trained tarot reader, soul map decoder, and QHHT past life regressionist. And I'm sure there will be so much more to add to that list in future, as my guides tend to have a way of putting things in my path that I just cannot ignore. But throughout this experience, and receiving the love and support from my fellow practitioners, had just been so inspiring that I felt that I needed to pass this feeling along to others. I guess you could say they're also my inspiration for this podcast, as I want this podcast to serve as your guide in how to make the most out of this life, how to heal, how to grow, and even just a reminder that all of our stories are important. And even on the bad days, there are better things on the horizon. Maybe you just haven't seen them yet. So whether you're starting your journey, or whether you've been on this path for a while, we all know life has its ups and downs. And while we journey through the uncharted depths of our subconscious minds, to understand our shadows, to make peace with them, meet our higher selves, and unlock our greatness and full potential. Some days will feel like the best day of your life. But I'm not gonna lie to you. Some days will be challenging. But you're not alone. And every experience is a learning experience, whether you perceive it as a good or a bad one. And in recording these episodes, my guests and I have shared stories that I know will resonate with so many of you. And I believe they'll inspire you to grow, to reevaluate, and maybe encourage you to change some old habits or perspectives. Actually, speaking of perspectives, I decided to call this episode Through the Looking Glass because I have three main reasons. Reason one, it's a play on the title, and look, I am nothing if I don't take a chance to be witty. And reason two, I have always had a slight obsession with fairy tales, and how they're so often perceived as black and white. Because when you first begin a story, you're introduced to your main and defining characters, right? You've got Prince Charming, your damsel in distress, the hero, the villain, and they all have their set roles, set programming of good or evil. And it's not often in fairy tales you find someone who has a complete transformation. It's not often you see a villain deal with their trauma and become a hero. We were raised on these stories. But life isn't a fairy tale. Life is all shades of grey. And we find ourselves being not one, but all of these characters in someone's story at some stage in our life. And I have to believe that one storyline, one act, does not define us, and we deserve the chance to grow and transform and discover who we really are underneath that character description. And reason number three, self-reflection is a major part of personal development. And a looking glass is just another name for a mirror. And in hiding my true self for so many years, I got to a point where I didn't recognize who I was in the mirror. And often fear and conditioning would stand in my way of ever really trying to understand the girl staring back at me. I was too worried about what people would think of me, or what I would think of me. What would happen if I looked behind the curtain to really understand how she worked? So yes, while this story is a bit of an origin story, it's also an act of self-reflection. Because even in telling you this story, I can acknowledge and celebrate just how far I've come. Over years, and over just a few weeks. I'm also bringing awareness to what I still need to work on. Because hey, I'm not perfect. Nobody is. And like I said, every experience is a learning experience. And we're all still learning, myself included. And although I've worked so hard to heal and to change, it's still important to look back. Not with sadness, but with gratitude. The reason I picked August 14th to launch this podcast is because it holds significant meaning to me. Today is the anniversary of my mother's death, and even though it was so many years ago now, through death comes rebirth. So as we begin this journey, I ask you to leave your expectations at the door. Because whatever we think about ourselves, about each other, about spirituality, trust me, there is so much more. And the best part is, we're in it together. So I guess that's me. Well, some parts of me anyway. The parts that maybe aren't so pretty, but I'm proud of them nonetheless. And yeah, maybe I'm not normal. But what is normal anyway? Just a matter of perspective. And like I mentioned at the start, normal, it just doesn't pique my curiosity. So, this is your Earthside Spirit Guide signing off for the week. Thanks for listening to the season premiere. To stay in the loop for more episodes, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the podcast. In fact, if you're curious for more now, you can go ahead and find episode 2 where I'm joined by my good friend Kelsey. It's available right now. If you'd like to know more about how you can work with me, you can find me on Instagram at elle.embers or on my website, elleembers.com.